if you're familiar with auteur theory, there's a lot of schools within the theory itself of how it works, how it operates. There are skeptics who don't think the thing exists. And then there are sort of intermediate people who think, well, it does exist, but we have to use the concept a little carefully. So usually with auteurs, we think that they have to have such an individualized style that they're wholly unique. I think that's a very extreme position. I think most people realize auteurs borrow from one another. They borrow from books, they borrow from films, they borrow from many different places. But occasionally clashes happen. I'm just going to go through a couple. The most obvious ones are sort of like Quentin Tarantino and Spike Lee clashing over Django Unchained. That's somewhat well known, right? That Spike Lee didn't like how Quentin did certain things with Samuel L. Jackson. They had a bit of a dispute, and I think it's been resolved. And more recently, Brian De Palma and I like Brian De Palma, but he was being very disrespectful to Steven Soderbergh when somebody tried to compare the two. And he says, well, no, you must be joking. I don't think there's any similarity between me and Soderbergh. And now we have the case, of course, of Denis Villeneuve and David Lynch. And it's a very curious case because David is on record. He doesn't care about Dune anymore. He doesn't really recognize Dune. He just owns Dune. But apparently Denis thinks there's still unfinished business because it's gotten mostly pretty good critical praise. But there is now a small contingent of people and critics who are saying, well, I understand what you were trying to do. And there are parts of Denis Villeneuve's Dune which are very spectacular, very well shot, sound quality and the music and all those things. However, they're still saying that, well, I think if we have to judge this fairly, the Lynch version is still somewhat better than this version, which only a couple years ago would have been considered heresy. And most people seem to agree, yeah, the Lynch version has certain things in it, but really at the end of the day, it just didn't work. And now the tide has slowly turned. And I think, and I'm just going to use a few specific examples, because obviously this could go on for a long time, where I think it's not just Lynch, it is also Frank Herbert that Denis really wants to make the definitive Dune, right? His Dune, right? It's now my Dune. And he may have done things that really weaken the film unnecessarily. And that's why some critics are being somewhat negative. And I think they have reason to be negative because, again, the choices were a little puzzling. So we'll just go through a few of them. Some of them are minor, and I'll get to the major thing, I think, with the Baron, which is much more interesting. But a few minor things he's changed is the ornithopters. In the book version, he is keeping that they're bugs, right? But now they're dragonflies. And that's fine, but that's a much more conventional design. And it's one known from Star Wars. I don't know if he's doing a Star Wars reference, but that's not the way it's described in the book. They're much more like birds or bugs, but bugs who are circular or round, right? That's more of the design of the ornithopters in the book. He's also doing some weird things with the colors, right? The Atreides are usually in dark blue, gray, and these dark colors. There is a little bit of red with Lady Jessica, but he's really changed the colors. And he does keep some of the symbolism, which is in the book, but it's much more stark and geometric. He is changing a lot of minor and major details. And if you know the books very well, you're like, okay, well, those are the books. But this is also very sharp contrast from the Lynch version, which is much more colorful. It's much more bright. And whatever you want to say about Lynch, in certain places, he's being very faithful to the book. Like the way the ornithopters work, you may sort of criticize it visually, but the design is very, very close to the books. Like they do look like birds. So there are places where Lynch did go his own way, but he also really did try to keep to the book. And Rafaela De Laurentiis, who helped produce it, affirms this, saying they really tried to do a lot of the book. So part of this is, of course, Denis' issues with Frank Herbert and trying to, quote, improve or modernize Dune from that perspective. But some of this is also Lynch, where it seems that he really wanted to make something distinctive in his own and doesn't want any real comparison with the 84 version. Because the Baron is very curious. So far in every adaptation, including this, he's always gotten a lot of praise. But there's a sharp difference in portrayal because with the Lynch version and the sci-fi version, we get a very dramatic, performative, a very over-the-top kind of Baron. But here, the Baron is much more subdued. He's still extremely evil, but he's more of a cameo. We don't really see him being outlandish, so he's being much more subtle. And we're seeing the effects of the conspiracy. but he's not personalizing it apparently in the same way that he did with the Lynch version or even the sci-fi version. So this version of the Baron is much more subdued. He's much more calculating, and he looks like this enormous dark beast animal. Whereas in the Lynch version and the sci-fi version, he was much more colorful. He was much more outgoing. He was very wicked, but very obviously wicked, and enjoyed being evil. And even in terms of the plot, because we do say Fayed at the beginning. Again, granted, Fayed is much more critical to the plot later, but Fayed apparently never shows up in the Denis Villeneuve version, and he never speaks to the Baron, at least not directly. So he's saving Fayed for part two, and that's fine, but again, it just seems that he didn't like the way, and he's been on record on this, he doesn't like the way that Sting portrayed Fayed. He thought that was a little too silly. He didn't like the way that Lynch used the Baron. He thought, no, that was a little over the top and that was a caricature. But he's not just criticizing Lynch, he is criticizing Frank Herbert. He is departing from the book because he thought, okay, certain parts didn't work. Okay, that's legitimate, but it does seem like stylistically he's just doing a lot of things to make sure he's not being accused of copying or just building upon Lynch, but that he's doing his own thing. It'll have such a distinct identity. There's no way you can really compare the 84 version to this version. But here's the problem, is it may have been to the detriment of the film in certain places, right? Because the Lynch version has a lot of issues and problems, but by doing the plot a certain way, we're so focused on Paul that there is a certain amount of dramatic tension, or at least a certain amount of energy. And the Baron is definitely, like, hands down, almost everyone says, it may be silly or you don't believe it, but it's very energetic. So whenever we go back to the Baron, it's a very set of energetic scenes. And apparently Denis has decided, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to just do what David did. So it's a really interesting case study where, again, it's not always the case, but auteurs, when they do the same material or the same book or the same movie, and they're doing a remake or a reimagining, they're just tempted to do something very radically different or just move the plot or style in such a different direction. And sometimes the film suffers unnecessarily. Now, sometimes it works. I mean, I think an interesting recent case is, again, recent relative terms, is Joe Schumacher's version of Batman with Batman Forever. That is very, very radically different from the Burton versions. There's a lot of major changes he made in the style, the tone, the costumes, everything was changed. But I think it didn't make it a better film than the Burton versions, but they're so visually their own thing. And I think it's a really great film. It's not as powerful as the Nolan films or the Burton films, but I think it's a very respectable and very interesting case study. And he is referencing the other films a little bit, but yeah, he's doing his own thing. But the film doesn't suffer. It's really going its own place. And it's still very energetic and very interesting in its own way. But I think Denis Villeneuve's Dune, as we're going to see, I think all of us, did unnecessarily sort of attack Lynch and sort of just try to go too far from Lynch for no reason, just because he didn't want to be identified within, I guess, the Lynchian style. And that's a fair choice. I guess it's just really puzzling to me because if you're just doing things that are different just to be different from the Lynch version, then you're not really doing your own thing. You're still being defined by the Lynch version, but apparently that's the way that Denis has chosen to go. So we'll see whether the general audiences respond to this, but it just kind of seems unnecessary, a little petty, and it feels like he has daddy issues with David Lynch, and the film has unnecessarily suffered because of it. But who knows? Maybe I myself will respond very positively because I will respond very positively to the changes made because I'm a big fan of the Lynch version, but I do recognize it has a lot of issues and problems. I was guessing, just hoping that it would be much more moderate, doing a lot of nods to the Lynch version. Again, he doesn't have to love it, and there would be a nice kind of union of all these different styles of Frank Herbert and David Lynch. Well, I guess this is going to be another case where auteurs have decided to clash with one another, and the film will have unnecessarily some flaws that may not have emerged if there was a much more, I don't know, interesting dialogue between these different versions of Dune. And that's where we stand. Thanks for listening.